I'm thirsty.
I said freeze!
I'm just getting a drink.
All right, had your drink. Now, I want you to...
I know. Freeze.
The Evoker is the Frozone master of Dragon Age the Veilguard. In today's build, we'll make enemies a little bit chilly, freeze them, and blow them up with fire. Let's go. Let me know what other mage build you'd like in the comments. We'll start with the abilities as we always do here. The Entropic Sphere is our first ability. This applies weakened. It does cold damage in an area. Now, area type abilities is something that's going to come up a lot in this build, and it's what really makes this build sing, so just keep that on your mind. The second ability we're using is Dark Squall that detonates Sunder. This is also a cold ability. It's a projectile and control ability. This is the specialization ability for this build. Now, for the most part, you won't be using this heaps only to detonate Sunder. That's the main reason you'll use it, whereas you will use Entropic Sphere and Frost Nova, our third ability, quite a lot because of the focus on area damage buffs that we have with this build. So you'll be increasing the size of both Frost Nova and Entropic Sphere, plus the amount of damage it does, plus gain additional effects from that from our skill line as well. Now, speaking of Frost Nova, this is an area that does cold damage, but the main thing here is it will freeze all the enemies within that radius. The bigger the radius, the more frozen the enemies are, because you're going to freeze more of them. Now, what you want to do is alternate between Frost Nova and Crystallize, which is a rune that you can get that will freeze enemies around you for 10 seconds, essentially through every single fight. You'll either be using Frost Nova, freeze everyone, wait for them to unfreeze via just, killing them, or the time passes, and then Crystallize to freeze them again, and alternating between those two throughout basically the entire fight while using Entropic Sphere for massive AoE damage while the effect is going. It'll then apply Weakened that you can detonate with a warrior as well. The last part that really brings this build together is our heavy attack. So the heavy attack for the staff, which is the main one that we're using, is like that arc attack on the ground. Now you can charge this up to 4 times with the Evoker Specialization. That effect gets significantly larger. It also does heaps more damage. You can actually make this a guaranteed critical hit with the Ice Shatter passive that you get in the Specialization. So when you freeze enemies and you use that, it'll be a guaranteed crit. Plus, because it's charged 4 times, the damage on that will be significantly larger, and it's a great burst damage attack that you can use on enemies, especially when they rush you. You can then use that, or say, hold that for boss fights or weak point attacks. It's really beneficial for those. But let's talk about the skills. Now, as always, I'm not going to go through every single skill here, but you can just copy the list and we'll just call out the specific ones that I wanted to mention. So now I'm just going to mouse over a lot of these area ability ones, as we are using a ton of them, and that's really critical for the Entropic Sphere and for Frost Nova. When you're leveling up, you'll get Frost Nova significantly earlier, and Frost Nova is the main one that you want to lean into with those area and those control buffs for increasing the radius and adding additional effects that you can add, as well as the overall damage that it can do. One thing to note is that we are only wearing light armor, which we'll talk about in the gear. So we're grabbing the light armor mastery. While we are wearing a light helm and armor, your staff energy charge rate is increased by 20% and the attack range is increased by 2. So you can hit more enemies with that effect, and that's part of that burst damage potential that we do have with this build. Elemental Catalyst will increase the overall damage of all of our cold stuff, because if we have an orb equipped that is cold, we'll get a little bit extra bonus damage to that cold. I also wanted to talk about a Bolt Volley, which is the trait that you grab right before the specialization. Now, this requires a lot of timing, so when you use a light attack just before that projectile comes out, if you press the light attack again, you'll get a second bolt that'll come out. There is actually a sound effect that plays when this does happen successfully, but it does require you to sort of relearn how to use your light attack combos, because it's sort of like a rhythm to it where it's you go but sort of thing. That's a terrible example, but you get it right. It's definitely something you've got to practice, but getting that extra bolt will obviously increase your overall damage output. Another thing to note is that I am grabbing Channeled Thoughts, which is all the way on the other side on the Death Caller line. What this does is it allows you to channel mana by holding your block. You'll be able to channel mana so you can get those effects off if you ever do need it. It's just a good ability to have, especially for a certain piece of gear that we'll talk about shortly. And lastly, in the specialization, once you hit level 30 and you can pick either the upper or the lower trait first, I would recommend to go Onslaught first, because the passives past that, like Staff Mastery, so Staff Light attacks do additional damage, plus be able to charge more for that extra burst damage is more beneficial. But the lower trait is also fantastic. Like Night Staves, you won't use as much. You'll use it occasionally for a little bit of burst damage, but it's mostly the Ice Shatter passive that we talked about earlier. That's fantastic underneath that, plus Bone Chiller that will freeze enemies all around you if you do hit low health. Moving on to gear, and we'll start with the Orb. I'm using Winter's Breath here because it is a cold attack, and you get all these buffs to chilled and charged attacks attacks. For the most part here, you're very rarely ever going to use the orb and the mage knife. I'm using the coral tip, but again, you'll probably not really switch to the mage knife very often for this build, as it is a star focused build. And because of that, we are using the glacial rod as our elemental staff. This does cold damage. It increases our heavy attack damage. Heavy attacks will also apply an additional chilled stack on a full staff energy, plus staff energy charge rate is increased, and you get 2 maximum chilled stacks that you can apply to enemies. And then I've enchanted this to add the projectile count as well. The headpiece, I am wearing the Frozen Facade, so when Frozen ends, it shatters, blasting nearby enemies with 150 cold damage. Because we're going to be constantly freezing enemies with Frost Nova and Crystallize, that's why this is fantastic. Chest piece, we're wearing the Wanderer's Long Cloak for the cold damage and cold bonuses that it does give us. And then moving on to the Grenade Belt, we're obviously using the cold one here, especially once you get it to Legendary for that extra chilled stack. The Amulet, we're using the Light of Stark Haven, which, as I mentioned earlier, as to why we're running Channel Thoughts, this is why, so we can either max out our mana or we can lose all our mana to get that additional weapon damage. That's really beneficial for this build. And then the Legendary Ring Bane of Smoke is fantastic for the cold benefits. And then I am using the Last Resort here. Each time you use an ability that hits an enemy, gain 20% damage and minus 20% to your resistances. Now, because we're freezing enemies constantly, the benefit or the hope here is that you can avoid having to, say, defend or dodge or even take damage, that this is the negative effects. And then you're simply just getting the benefits from that extra damage when we're dumping in these abilities with Frost Nova and Crystallize, etc. So what companions are best here? Now, you definitely have to be running a warrior with a ranged mage build like this because of the taunt. I personally lean Davron, as he has better taunt effects, like the different passives that you can get, especially that it auto triggers when enemies are at low health, and he has a certain shield that can add taunt whenever you use attack my target on that specific target, which I do quite like. It's also viable to run both of the warriors, like you could totally do that and then just alternate taunts, like have one detonate your effects and then have one just simply for taunt, just to pull that pressure off you. It definitely helps, especially in the early game until you get Crystallize and you get Frost Nova into those large area of effect abilities that really can freeze enemies and lock them in place. And the other, you probably want a Rogue. Lucanus and Harding are both fantastic, as they can finish off any of your detonations or apply effects that you can detonate right now. The benefit to Lucanus is that he can auto apply enhanced damage with one of his skills, so I typically lean Lucanus for that reason, but both of them are totally fine. It's up to whatever flavor you choose. Some mage tips for running this Evoker build: you can fully charge your staff out of combat. I would recommend to do that as well, so you can enter combat and you've got that burst potential. That damage that you get from that heavy attack is something you should absolutely be weaving into your combos, as it is really critical, and it can also be critical with Ice Shatter, right? And it's just a fantastic way to finish off enemies or deal damage when you can knock them down and finish them off. The Shadow Dragon's Vendor is the main one you want to level up for all the juicy gear that it does give you, though a lot of the cold damage gear is hard to find out in the world. But the main thing that I wanted to bring up in this block is how blocking, funnily enough, works for a mage, especially using the staff. So when you like defend and you hold that, you get that like bubble around you. That bubble is actually charged by your mana. So the more mana you have, the better that bubble will look, the more solid. The lower the mana you have, it'll eventually go red and it will break if you do run out of mana. And likewise, when you do actually get hit, when enemies do hit you, when you've got that banner up, you will take like damage to your mana, like you'll lose mana and it'll actually lose like the effectiveness of that bubble as well. So just keep that in mind if you are leaning into that bubble. But once you've got Crystallize and the Frost Nova really kick in, you don't need it as much, because you can just freeze enemies when you get that too much pressure on you. And then also when you hit low health, they'll auto freeze everything around you anyway. But in that early game, you'll definitely be leaning into that bubble quite a lot. So it's good to understand exactly how it works. But let me know your thoughts on this build and any other questions or tips or things you have about the mage in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.